The room went quiet when my father said it. We were standing in the center of my family's New Year's party, surrounded by crystal glasses, catered food, and people who had known me my entire life, but never really seen me. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just looked at me the way he always did when he wanted to remind me where I belonged. "If you fail," he said calmly, "then go live in the streets." A few guests laughed, unsure if it was a joke. Most of them didn't. My mother stared down into her champagne flute as if the answer to everything might be floating there. My sister smiled just for a second, then smoothed her expression like nothing had happened. No one defended me. What my father didn't know, what no one in that glittering room knew, was that I had already earned $20 million on my own. I wasn't asking for help. I wasn't failing. I hadn't depended on this family in years. But I didn't say a word, because standing there being dismissed like I was disposable, something colder than humiliation settled in my chest. That kind of confidence doesn't come from cruelty alone. It comes from certainty, from believing the ground beneath you is solid. And as the countdown music swelled and people raised their glasses, I realized something far worse than an insult had already happened behind my back. Something quiet, something practical, something that would attach my name to a debt I had never signed. If you've ever been pushed out of your own family without anyone admitting it, you'll understand why I stayed silent. And why that night was only the beginning. My name is Rowan Hale. I was 29 years old that night, and I was standing in a house that had never truly felt like mine. The party itself was flawless, the kind my parents prided themselves on hosting. Warm lighting, hired staff, a pianist tucked discreetly into the corner. Everything was designed to look effortless, successful, unshakable. From the outside, we were the kind of family people admired. Inside, we were a hierarchy, and I had just been reminded of my rank. I didn't argue with my father. I didn't laugh it off. I didn't explain myself. I nodded once the way you do when a conversation is already over, and stepped away before anyone could decide whether to pity me or ignore me. That choice confused people more than anger would have. As I moved toward the edge of the room, I caught fragments of conversation drifting back into place like the pause had never mattered. Someone commented on the catering. Someone else asked about my sister's company. The music grew louder. The moment passed for everyone except me. I could have told them the truth. I could have said that I owned stakes in companies they had never heard of, that my income didn't come from favors or inheritance, that my life was quieter and stronger than the one they imagined for me. I could have corrected the story they'd been telling themselves for years. But I'd learned something a long time ago. In this family, explanations were invitations. They invited debate, doubt, and dismissal. Silence, on the other hand, made people underestimate you, and underestimation had kept me safe. I left before midnight, slipping out while everyone else focused on the countdown. No one noticed. No one texted to ask where I'd gone. That wasn't new either. Outside, the air was cold and sharp, the kind that clears your head whether you want it to or not. I sat in my car for a moment, hands on the wheel, listening to the distant sound of fireworks starting to crack open the sky. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the need to. What I felt was recognition. My father's words hadn't hurt because they were cruel. They hurt because they were rehearsed. He'd said them like someone delivering a conclusion, not an opinion, like a man who believed the outcome was already decided. On the drive home, my phone stayed silent. No messages from my mother asking if I was okay, no apology from my father, no awkward check-in from my sister, just empty space, the kind I'd grown used to filling on my own. When I reached my apartment, a place I'd chosen because it was quiet and entirely mine, I kicked off my shoes and stood in the dark for a long moment. The night felt unfinished, like a sentence without punctuation. Something was wrong. I didn't know what yet, but I could feel it. Not emotionally, logistically. People don't humiliate you in public unless they believe you're cornered, and people like my father didn't gamble on appearances without a reason. I went to bed that night with the strange sense that my absence had been accounted for long before I left the room. If you're still listening to this, stay with me. Because the story doesn't get louder from here. It gets quieter, more precise. And the next thing I discovered had nothing to do with feelings at all. If you want to hear how a family insult turned into a legal nightmare, and how silence became the most powerful move I ever made, follow the story as it unfolds. And if stories about dignity, consequences, and quiet reversals resonate with you, you might want to stay close. Some truths take time to surface, but when they do, they change everything. I left the party without anyone stopping me, which told me everything I needed to know. The driveway was still lined with cars, their engines ticking softly in the cold, as if they were alive and listening. Inside the house, laughter rose and fell on cue. Outside, the silence felt honest. I walked to my car with my head up, not because I was brave, but because I'd learned long ago that lowering it only gave people permission to look down on you. On the drive home, my father's voice replayed in my mind, not the words themselves, but the ease with which he'd said them. He hadn't been angry. He hadn't been emotional. He'd been certain. That certainty had a history, and I knew it well. In my family, nothing was ever said directly until it had already been decided. By the time I reached my apartment, the sting of the moment had dulled into something more familiar. Recognition. That comment at the party wasn't an explosion. It was punctuation at the end of a sentence that had been written years ago. I had always known my place in that family. They just rarely said it out loud. Growing up, there were unspoken rules everyone seemed to understand without acknowledging. Who spoke at the table and who waited. Whose opinions were debated and whose were politely ignored. Whose mistakes were considered learning experiences and whose were treated as proof of character. My sister was always the safe bet. If she took a risk and failed, it meant she was bold. If I did the same, it meant I was reckless. When she succeeded, it was celebrated as destiny. When I succeeded, it was explained away as luck or timing. No one ever yelled at me. No one openly insulted me until that night. Instead, they perfected a quieter method. They listened just long enough to say they had then redirected the conversation to something that mattered more to them. They smiled while doing it. That made it harder to object. My father ran the family the way he ran everything else, with calm authority and no tolerance for inefficiency. He didn't believe in cruelty. He believed in order. And in his mind, order meant knowing who was valuable and who was expendable. At dinner, he spoke, and the room adjusted itself around his voice. Decisions weren't argued. They were announced. He had a way of making people feel included while still reminding them who was in charge. If you disagreed with him, he didn't correct you. He simply moved on, leaving you standing alone with your unfinished thought. I learned early that pushing back only made you invisible faster. My mother was different, but not in the way people liked to imagine. She wasn't harsh. She wasn't cold. She was careful. Her silence wasn't ignorance. It was strategy. She survived by not choosing sides, by pretending neutrality was kindness. When my father dismissed me, she didn't agree with him. She also didn't stop him. She watched the way someone watches a storm from inside, grateful it isn't aimed directly at them. For years, I told myself that meant something, that her quiet was a form of love. Eventually, I understood it was a form of self-preservation. My sister learned to thrive inside that system. She didn't create it, but she knew how to benefit from it. Praise came easily to her. Mistakes were softened before they landed. Even when her choices strained the family resources, they were framed as investments. She was encouraged to take up space. I was encouraged to be reasonable. The difference wasn't just in how we were treated. It was in what was expected of us. I was expected to adapt, to understand, to not take things personally. She was expected to succeed, and when she didn't, the system bent to protect her anyway. At some point, I stopped explaining myself. I can remember the exact moment. I'd come home for a holiday years ago and tried to talk about a decision I'd made something important to me at the time. My father had nodded. My mother had smiled, and my sister had interrupted halfway through to talk about a problem she was having. The conversation never returned to me. That was the night I realized my words weren't landing because there was no space reserved for them. From then on, I answered questions briefly. I shared less. I let them believe what they wanted. Silence wasn't surrender. It was efficiency. Being invisible had a cost, though. When people don't see you as present, they don't see you as someone who needs to be consulted. Decisions get made around you, sometimes about you. That was the part I hadn't fully understood yet. After the New Year's party, the days that followed were strangely normal. No one reached out to apologize. No one asked if I was hurt. The absence of reaction felt intentional, like waiting to see if I'd caused trouble by naming what had happened. I didn't. From the outside, it probably looked like I'd accepted my role. The failed daughter, the difficult one, the person who didn't quite fit the picture. What they didn't see was how comfortable I'd become operating outside their frame. A few days later, a comment from a distant relative reached me through a mutual contact. Something casual said without malice. A remark about how my parents had been worried about me lately. About how things had been hard for me financially. I paused when I heard it. The story wasn't just internal anymore. It was being told out loud without me in the room. I didn't correct it. I didn't ask where it had come from. I filed it away with everything else. Patterns matter more than details, and this one fit too neatly. By then, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. Being overlooked hadn't just made me lonely, it had made me convenient. No one expected resistance from me. No one imagined I'd challenge a decision once it had been made. I was the quiet one, the reasonable one, the one who would eventually understand why things had happened the way they did. That assumption was the most dangerous thing about me. When people believe you won't object, they stop asking for permission. And when they stop asking, they start taking. I didn't know what had been taken yet. I only knew that the shape of my life as they described it to others no longer matched the one I was actually living. And that mismatch was growing. As I went about my days, something small kept tugging at the back of my mind. A detail that didn't belong. A sense that my name was being used in places I hadn't been. I couldn't have explained it then. It was just a tightening like a thread pulled too far. I had spent years learning how to disappear in my own family. I hadn't considered what that disappearance might allow others to do in my absence. And for the first time, I wondered if being invisible had crossed from protection into vulnerability. The morning after the party, I woke up without an alarm and without the weight I'd expected to feel. Sunlight slid through the narrow gap between the curtains, clean and pale, touching the edge of my desk and the spine of a book I'd left open the night before. My apartment was quiet in the way only a place you've chosen for yourself can be. No echoes of raised voices, no reminders of who was in charge. Just space. I made coffee, the kind I liked, strong and uncomplicated, and stood by the window while the city shook itself awake below. Cars moved with purpose. People walked where they were going. The world functioned without needing to know where I'd been the night before or what had been said to me. That steadiness was something my family had never understood about my life. They assumed silence meant stagnation. Distance meant drift. But my days had structure. My work demanded attention, judgment, and restraint. I was accountable to outcomes, not opinions. By mid-morning, I was back in my routine. Calls, messages, decisions that carried consequences far beyond polite conversation. I didn't announce my role in these things to anyone who didn't need to know. I never had. Power, I'd learned, worked better when it wasn't explained. People spoke to me differently outside my family. They listened. They asked questions and waited for the answers. When I said no, it meant something. When I said yes, it carried weight. There were contracts with my name on them that had nothing to do with my parents' house or my sister's company or the stories told about me at holiday tables. I didn't think about the number then. I rarely did. Money past a certain point became less about accumulation and more about insulation. Time. Choice. The ability to walk away without asking permission. Those were the things I valued, and I'd built my life carefully around them. I never corrected my family's assumptions because there was nothing to gain from it. Years earlier, I'd tried. I'd shared a milestone once spoken too openly about a project I was proud of. My father had listened with polite interest before asking how long it would last. My mother had suggested I not get ahead of myself. My sister had changed the subject entirely. After that, I stopped offering information they'd only used to reframe me back into something smaller. Privacy wasn't secrecy, it was efficiency. The irony was that my success depended on clarity and transparency everywhere else. I reviewed financials daily, I monitored exposure, I knew exactly where my name appeared and why, or at least I believed I did. That belief had always been part of my sense of safety. I trusted systems more than people. Systems left trails, people left interpretations. Later that afternoon, as I was finishing a call, a notification crossed my screen. Routine. Automated. The kind of thing you glance at and dismiss without thinking. I almost did. It wasn't alarming. No red flags, no urgent language, just a reference number and a brief line about account activity. I marked it for review and moved on, my attention already shifting back to the work in front of me. At the time, it felt unimportant. A background noise in a day full of decisions. That night, I cooked dinner and ate alone at the small table near the window. I scrolled through messages I hadn't responded to from my family and left them unread. Silence, I knew, made people uncomfortable. It forced them to sit with their assumptions longer. Somewhere across town, my sister was probably convincing herself that the party had gone well, that my father's comment had landed exactly where he'd intended, that I would retreat quietly the way I always had. I didn't blame her for thinking that. From her perspective, things had always worked out. Her company was still being spoken about with admiration, though the tone had shifted recently. Expansion. Growth. Pressure disguised as ambition. I'd noticed the way she talked about it now, faster, less certain, as if momentum alone could keep the structure standing. I didn't connect that to myself yet. I had no reason to. Before bed, I reviewed my schedule for the week. Meetings. Deadlines. Nothing unexpected. My life, in its own way, was remarkably boring. That bored my family more than anything else about me. They preferred narratives with drama, with visible struggle. They didn't understand that boredom was the reward. I slept well that night, unaware that a version of my name was already circulating in places I hadn't authorized. That documents existed with signatures that looked enough like mine to pass at a glance. That urgency somewhere else had overridden caution, and my invisibility had been mistaken for consent. The next few days passed without incident. I worked, I exercised. I ignored a voicemail from my mother that asked in a careful voice whether I was doing okay. The question was too late to mean anything. On the fourth day, I opened the notification I'd marked earlier. I told myself I was just being thorough. The screen refreshed, numbers resolved into context, and for the first time, something didn't align. I stared at it longer than I needed to, not because I was confused, but because my mind was recalibrating. The part of me that dealt in risk and probability was already awake, already sorting possibilities, already dismissing the most generous explanations. This wasn't a mistake. It was an introduction. I closed the file without reacting and leaned back in my chair, hands resting loosely in my lap. My heart wasn't racing. My breath was steady. But something fundamental had shifted. I had believed that keeping my life separate had kept it protected. That distance was a barrier no one would cross. I was wrong. Whatever had happened, it had happened quietly, the way all real damage does. And as I sat there looking at the familiar lines of my own name in an unfamiliar context, I understood something with sudden clarity. The people who thought I wasn't paying attention had made a very expensive assumption. The alert itself was unremarkable. No flashing icons, no urgent language, just a neutral subject line and a reference number that meant nothing to me at first glance. I'd seen hundreds like it over the years, automated messages designed to keep records clean and liabilities transparent. Normally I skimmed them and moved on. This one stayed open on my screen longer than it should have. I read it again slower this time, not because the wording was complex, but because the familiarity of my own name in that context felt wrong. It was there, typed cleanly, spelled correctly, paired with an institution I recognized, and an amount that made my stomach tighten. $680,000. For a moment, I assumed a clerical error. That was the rational place to start. Systems failed, data misfiled, accounts crossed. I'd seen all of it before. I logged into my financial dashboard expecting to clear it up in minutes. I didn't panic. Panic wastes time. I followed the trail methodically. Account number, lending institution, guarantor details. Everything led back to me. Not a variation of my name, not a distant association. Me. My legal identity clean and intact, attached to a loan I had never applied for, never authorized, never signed. The date stopped me. I knew exactly where I'd been that day. I could picture it without effort. A flight, a meeting, a signature of my own on a completely different document in a completely different state. There was no overlap, no gray area. This wasn't a mistake. I opened the attached documents, my expression neutral, my pulse steady. The signature at the bottom of the page was close enough to mine to fool someone who wasn't looking too hard. A practiced imitation. Confident. Familiar. Someone had taken their time with it. The loan terms were aggressive. Short runway. High expectations. It wasn't structured for growth. It was structured for survival. And buried in the paperwork clear as day was the entity benefiting from it. My sister's company. I sat back and exhaled slowly through my nose, not in disbelief, in recognition. This was worse than the money. $680,000 was manageable, annoying but not catastrophic. What mattered was exposure. As guarantor, the liability didn't stop at the loan itself. It reached into everything attached to my name: assets, credit, reputation. One default could trigger a cascade that would take years to untangle. That was the point. I checked the notarization next. It had been done properly on paper. Dates aligned, stamps in place, too neat, too compliant. Notaries were cautious by nature. They verified identities, they kept records, which meant someone I trusted had stood in front of one. I didn't let myself finish that thought yet. Instead, I followed procedure. I documented everything. Took screenshots, logged access times, copied files into a secure folder I rarely needed but always maintained. My movements were automatic muscle memory from years of managing risk. As I worked, fragments of the past few weeks rearranged themselves in my mind. The way my father had spoken at the party with that unshakable certainty. The story about me being unstable, struggling quietly, failing, already circulating without my input. The absence of concern when I didn't respond. They hadn't humiliated me because they were cruel. They'd done it because they needed the narrative in place. If I was already the disappointment, the liability, the problem, then attaching my name to a desperate loan made sense. If things went wrong, it would look like confirmation, not theft. I would be the irresponsible one. Again. I closed my laptop and stood pacing the length of my living room once, then twice. The anger came late, controlled more heat than noise. Not because they'd taken money, because they'd decided I wouldn't notice until it was too late. That was the miscalculation. I didn't call my sister. I didn't confront my parents. I didn't demand explanations or apologies. Confrontation was for people who needed answers. I already had them. Instead, I opened a new document and began building a timeline. When the loan had been initiated, when the paperwork had been finalized, when the party had taken place, when the story about me had started spreading. Each event lined up with unsettling precision. This wasn't impulsive. It was engineered. I thought about how easily they'd chosen me. The invisible one. The reasonable one. The one who never made scenes or demanded credit. The one they believed would absorb the damage quietly the way I always had. That assumption had protected them until now. I made a call to the lending institution, keeping my tone professional, detached. I didn't accuse. I asked questions, requested clarification, verified data. The representative confirmed everything I already knew, unaware of the ground shifting beneath the conversation. When the call ended, I sat very still. There was a moment then when the shape of my relationship with my family finally changed. Not emotionally, structurally. The moment when the word family stopped meaning context and started meaning conflict. They hadn't crossed a line, they'd erased it. I considered my options carefully. There were many, and most of them were loud. Criminal charges, public exposure, legal battles that would drag every private detail into the open and leave nothing but wreckage behind. Those options satisfied emotion. I wasn't interested in satisfaction. What I wanted was control. I looked again at the loan terms, at the deadlines, at the way urgency had been built into every clause. Whoever had arranged this had been counting on time to do the damage, counting on me discovering it late, scrambling, explaining, pleading. I smiled once without humor. Time was something I had. By the end of the night, I had decided exactly what I would do. Not when I would reveal myself, not how I would confront them, but how I would let them continue believing the story they'd written. I would remain silent. I would let the debt sit where it was, let the pressure build, let them assume they'd succeeded. And when the moment came, I wouldn't accuse them of what they'd done. I would own it. As I shut down my computer and turned off the lights, the apartment returned to its familiar quiet. Nothing in the room had changed. Everything in my life had. The insult at the party hadn't been the beginning. This was. And they had no idea how irreversible it was about to become. The call came 3 days later, and it told me more than any confession ever could. It was my mother, her voice light, almost cheerful the way it always was when she wanted to test the ground without leaving footprints. She asked how I was doing, mentioned the weather, said she'd been thinking about me since the party. She did not mention the loan. I let her speak, answering in short, neutral sentences, giving her nothing to push against. When there was a pause, I said casually that I'd been reviewing some financial matters and that things had been busier than usual. She didn't ask what kind of matters. She didn't sound confused or alarmed. She didn't rush to fill the silence with questions the way someone innocent would. She simply acknowledged it and changed the subject as if financial complications were expected, even accounted for. That was the moment I knew. If they hadn't known about the loan, fear would have surfaced first. Panic, even briefly. But what I heard instead was composure, the kind that comes from believing a situation is under control. After we hung up, I sat very still, replaying the call in my head. There was no guilt in her tone, no hesitation, just the careful calm of someone waiting to see how much I knew. Later that evening, my father sent a text. Not about the party, not about his comment, just a clipped message asking if I was handling things and reminding me to be responsible. The phrasing was deliberate. I didn't respond. Over the next few days, I began to cross-reference everything. Not just documents, but behavior. Dates, conversations, small moments I'd dismissed at the time, the pressure before the party, the way my sister had avoided eye contact afterward, the sudden concern for my stability that seemed to appear out of nowhere. It formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The story about me had been written in advance, failing, unsteady, in need of guidance. That narrative made it easier to justify what they'd done. If I was already a liability, then using my name as collateral wouldn't seem like theft. It would seem practical. I turned my attention to my sister's company. From the outside, it still looked impressive. Press releases about growth, photos from networking events, confident language. But the numbers told a different story. Expansion without infrastructure, revenue that lagged behind ambition, cash flow that depended on momentum rather than stability. The loan wasn't fuel. It was a life raft. And life rafts are thrown to people who believe they're about to drown. I understood then why they'd chosen me. Not because I was the weakest, but because I was the quietest. I had credit. I had assets. And I had a long history of not making scenes. They assumed I would absorb the impact the way I always had. Quietly. Reasonably. Without burning everything down. That assumption had shaped every move they'd made. The temptation to confront them was strong. To call my sister and ask her how she'd slept at night. To demand my father explain how telling me to live in the streets squared with forging my signature. To finally force my mother to choose a side. But confrontation would have done exactly what they expected. It would have shifted the focus to emotion, to loyalty, to family. Emotion was where they still believed they had power. So I did the opposite. I withdrew. I stopped answering messages altogether. I let calls go to voicemail. I didn't ask questions or make threats. I didn't even hint that I knew what they'd done. Silence in this context wasn't passive. It was strategic. I spent my evenings organizing evidence instead. Every document, every communication, every time-stamped record went into a system I trusted. I created a timeline so precise it left no room for interpretation. Not for a lawyer, not for a judge, not for anyone. As I worked, something unexpected happened. The hurt faded, not all at once but steadily replaced by clarity. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. The situation stopped feeling personal and started feeling procedural. That shift changed everything. I began thinking in outcomes instead of grievances, in leverage instead of explanations, in what would end this cleanly rather than loudly. One night as I reviewed the loan agreement again, I noticed how narrow the window was, how little margin there was for error. Whoever had structured it had been in a hurry, counting on time to apply pressure where guilt would not. Time, however, was on my side. I had resources they didn't know about, patience they didn't expect, and distance that protected me from their influence. The family dynamic I'd grown up with depended on my participation, my need for approval, my willingness to explain myself. Without that, it lost its grip. I realized then that the greatest advantage I had wasn't money or information. It was that I no longer needed them to understand me. When my father called again this time more directly, I didn't pick up. He left a message that sounded firm on the surface but brittle underneath, reminding me of obligations of family of consequences. He didn't mention the loan. They were waiting for me to break, to demand answers, to ask for help. Every day I didn't do that made them more confident that their plan was working. I let them believe it. By the end of the week, my decision was made. Not about whether I would act, but how. I wasn't going to accuse them of betrayal. I wasn't going to expose them publicly or drag the past into the light. I was going to use the same language they understood: contracts, deadlines, ownership. They had used my name because they thought it was empty. Soon they would learn how wrong they were. Silence had always been my role in that family. This time it wasn't a weakness. It was the sharpest tool I had. The first call I made wasn't to my family. It was to someone who had no emotional investment in my last name. I waited until mid-morning when offices were calm and people were thinking clearly, and I kept my tone neutral. I didn't say fraud. I didn't say betrayal. I said I needed verification on a guarantor obligation tied to my identity and asked what exposure I might be facing if the loan went into default. The response was immediate and precise. They walked me through the language the way professionals do when they've said it 100 times before. As guarantor, I was responsible for the full amount if the borrower failed to perform. If payments stopped, notices would trigger. If notices were ignored, remedies would follow. Liens, freezes, escalation. The kind of consequences that don't care about family dynamics. I thanked them and asked for copies of everything on file. When the documents arrived, I reviewed them line by line, not looking for emotion, but for leverage. The structure confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't a loan built for growth. It was built to survive a collapse that had already started. I provided specimen signatures next, mine taken from multiple contexts spanning years. The comparison came back quietly. The forged signature wasn't sloppy. It was practiced. Close enough to pass a casual review. Not close enough to withstand scrutiny. The word forgery wasn't used yet. It didn't need to be. What mattered was certainty. We moved on to the notarization. The stamp was legitimate. The date was clean. The notary had done their job, which meant the person who signed had been physically present with documentation convincing enough to pass. That narrowed the field to people who knew me well. I didn't let myself dwell on that. Dwelling didn't change facts. The professional on the other end of the call explained my options without judgment. Criminal action was available. Identity theft carried weight. Civil remedies existed too. Paths to recover damages and unwind liability. Then, almost as an aside, they mentioned another route. Distressed debt changes hands all the time. Lenders sell risk to clean their books, especially when documentation is compromised, especially when litigation looms. Sometimes control is gained not by arguing but by purchasing. I asked them to explain the process. They did. When the call ended, I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment, not because I was overwhelmed, but because the shape of the solution had just revealed itself. It wasn't loud. It wasn't righteous. It was elegant. I didn't decide immediately. I never did. I let the idea sit, turning it over from every angle, looking for flaws. Exposure. Traceability. Timing. That afternoon, I had another call, this time with someone who specialized in ensuring distance. Structures. Entities. Firewalls that kept identities clean and intentions opaque. I spoke in hypotheticals. They answered in certainties. By the end of the conversation, I knew exactly how invisible I could be. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not from anxiety, but from calculation. I replayed the last few weeks in reverse, watching how easily my family had mistaken my quiet for compliance. How confidently they'd acted, believing I would absorb the consequences the way I always had. They hadn't accounted for the fact that I no longer needed to be right. I only needed to be positioned. The next morning, I made a list, not of grievances, of steps. Who needed to know what, and who needed to know nothing at all. I separated the emotional from the operational and set the former aside. When my father called again, I let it ring. When my sister texted, I didn't open it. Every attempt at contact confirmed what I already understood. They were monitoring my silence, waiting for a sign of distress. Silence in their experience always preceded concession. This time, it preceded ownership. The confirmation came later that week. Independent review. Documentation validated. Exposure quantified. The risk was real. The forgery was provable. There was no misunderstanding left to resolve. That was the moment I felt something close to grief. Not for what they'd done, but for the version of them I'd held on to longer than I should have. The idea that there had been a line they wouldn't cross. There hadn't been. With that clarity came relief. I instructed my advisors to proceed carefully. No acceleration, no alerts, no sudden movements. Let the loan age naturally. Let the pressure remain invisible. Let my family believe they were still ahead of the problem. I understood then why silence had always unsettled them. It removed their ability to recalibrate. Without feedback, they were blind. And blindness was expensive. I spent the next few days doing what I'd always done best. Working, deciding, maintaining my routines. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. The debt sat where it was ticking quietly. Notices queued but not yet delivered. Timelines stretched. Options remained open. So did mine. I thought briefly about calling my mother, about explaining, about giving her a chance to say something that might soften what was coming. Then I remembered how easily silence had served her all these years. I owed no one a warning. By the end of the week, the plan was complete. Not the execution, the framework. Solid enough to carry weight, clean enough to withstand scrutiny. I wasn't delaying justice. I was choosing it. As I closed my laptop that night, I felt no triumph, no anger, just a steady sense of alignment. For the first time since the party, my father's words lost their power. If you fail, go live in the streets. He had believed failure was something that happened loudly, visibly in front of witnesses. He was wrong. Failure was quiet, procedural, and it was about to change hands. I turned off the light and let the darkness settle calm and complete. The next move wouldn't be mine alone anymore. It would belong to the paper. And the paper never hesitated. Distance became my camouflage. From the outside, nothing about my behavior changed. I went to work, I kept my schedule, I returned messages that mattered and ignored the ones that didn't. If anyone had been watching closely, they would have seen a woman who had retreated after being embarrassed at a family party exactly as expected. That assumption protected me better than any lock. My family filled the silence with their own conclusions. My father likely interpreted it as acceptance. My sister probably assumed the pressure had scared me into backing off. My mother, as always, chose not to ask questions she might not want the answers to. I let them believe whatever made them comfortable. Behind that quiet, the structure was taking shape. I didn't buy the debt in my own name. I didn't touch it directly. Instead, I created distance the way professionals do layers that turned intention into procedure and identity into paperwork. A neutral holding entity. Clean formation. No connection back to me that could be followed without already knowing where to look. Everything was designed to look ordinary, because in the financial world, ordinary is invisible. The bank didn't resist when the conversation turned to transfer. They never do when risk starts outweighing reward. The loan had already been flagged internally. Too tight. Too fragile. The documentation was technically valid, but the forgery concern made it radioactive. Litigation would be expensive. Public. Unpredictable. Selling was cleaner. I authorized the negotiation without emotion. Numbers were exchanged. Terms adjusted. The face value dropped in ways that reflected urgency rather than generosity. When the final amount was agreed upon, it felt almost anticlimactic. A routine transaction. The moment ownership transferred, nothing in my life visibly changed. There was no announcement, no internal shift in posture or mood. I closed the file and moved on to the next item on my list. Power doesn't arrive with a feeling. It arrives with options. I reviewed what ownership actually gave me: control over timelines, authority to enforce, the ability to restructure, to demand compliance, or to pull the thread until everything unraveled. Rights my family assumed belonged to someone else, someone they believed they could intimidate or delay. They were wrong. I resisted the urge to reveal myself immediately. The satisfaction would have been temporary, the consequences less precise. Timing mattered more than truth in this phase. Pressure needed space to work. So I waited. The calls from the bank stopped abruptly. No reminders, no follow-ups. The silence was misread as relief. My father likely congratulated himself on having handled the situation. My sister probably slept better believing the worst had passed. Confidence returned quickly when there was nothing left to push against. I watched from a distance as my sister resumed her plans. Meetings scheduled, announcements drafted. The language of expansion crept back into her vocabulary, thinly masking the instability underneath. It was the kind of confidence that depends entirely on momentum. Momentum is fragile. Inside my family, things settled into an uneasy calm. My father reasserted himself socially, telling people the situation had been resolved. The narrative corrected itself without my involvement. I was still the problem, but a managed one. A disappointment that had been contained. That suited me just fine. In private, I read the reports as they came in. Payment schedules, compliance windows, all of it aligned exactly as expected. The debt was already pressing against a structure that couldn't support it. Time was no longer their ally. It was mine. There were moments when memory tried to intrude. A flash of my sister as a child, confident and unquestioned. My mother smoothing things over. My father's certainty filling rooms. I let those images pass without engaging them. This wasn't about resentment. It was about accuracy. They had built their lives on assumptions about me. That I would bend. That I would accept whatever was decided for me. That my silence meant agreement. Ownership rewrote that equation completely. I didn't feel joy in it. I felt clarity. The kind that arrives when you finally stop arguing with reality and start working with it instead. A week passed, then another. The pressure began to surface in small ways. Delays blamed on logistics, tension in communications. Staff turnover explained away as coincidence. Each sign confirmed what the numbers already showed. The structure was weakening. I chose not to accelerate anything. No sudden notices, no dramatic moves. Waiting sharpened the edge better than force ever could. Uncertainty did the work for me. At night, when my phone buzzed with messages from my family, I left them unopened. Not as punishment, but as boundary. The role I'd played for them for decades was gone, and I wasn't interested in rehearsing it one last time. Silence had changed meaning. Before it had been survival. Now it was authority. I thought briefly about what would happen when they finally learned the truth. The shock. The scramble to reframe. The instinct to make it personal again. To accuse me of cruelty or betrayal as if they hadn't authored the situation themselves. Those conversations would come later. Or they wouldn't. Either way, the outcome was already written. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to explain my choices. The paper would do that for me line by line, clause by clause, without anger or apology. By the time the first formal deadline approached, my family still believed they were dealing with an external problem. A faceless institution. A temporary obstacle. They had no idea they were already speaking to me through contracts and timelines. That was the most important part. I had stepped completely out of the family dynamic without announcing it. No farewell, no confrontation, just absence clean and final. The debt sat where it belonged now. In my hands, though, they couldn't see them. The trap wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cruel. It was closed quietly the way doors are when you're no longer expected to come back. And as I prepared for the next phase, I understood something with absolute certainty. They had mistaken my silence for surrender. What it really was ownership waiting to be revealed. The silence from the bank was the first thing my father noticed. It wasn't dramatic. No calls, no reminders, no letters thick with legal language. Just an absence where pressure had been. To him, that meant success. He had always believed that problems backed down when confronted firmly enough that institutions folded if you spoke to them with authority. I could almost hear the relief in his voice as he told people the situation was handled. My sister felt it too. Her messages grew lighter, the edge softening as days passed without consequences. She started talking about timelines again, about momentum, about getting back to normal. Confidence returned to her posture in photos I saw online, the practiced smile reappearing as if the ground beneath her hadn't been cracking for months. They mistook quiet for mercy. Behind that calm, the pressure was shifting into place. Vendors began to stall, citing delays and internal reviews. Small things at first, easy to dismiss. A shipment postponed, a contract revised. Staff turnover explained away as coincidence. Each disruption seemed unrelated on its own. Together they formed a pattern that only someone watching closely would recognize. I watched. From a distance, I followed the updates as they filtered through channels that had nothing to do with family. Reports, schedules, payment calendars. The numbers never lied even when people did. Cash flow tightened, margins thinned. The structure leaned further on a debt my sister believed was no longer a threat. Inside the house, the mood shifted subtly. My mother tried to smooth it over the way she always had, reminding everyone to stay calm, to trust that things would work out. My father responded with certainty, dismissing concerns as overreactions. Control he believed came from sounding unshaken. Cracks appeared anyway. Arguments moved behind closed doors. Blame began to circulate quietly, never settling in one place for long. My sister grew sharper, her confidence brittle. The narrative of effortless success required too much maintenance now. I stayed absent. When my phone buzzed, I let it buzz. When emails arrived, I didn't open them. Not because I was angry, but because engagement would have been a signal. Signals invite response. Silence forced them to guess. The first formal deadline approached without announcement. I chose not to move it forward or delay it. Time left untouched did the work for me. Uncertainty stretched nerves thinner than confrontation ever could. I reviewed the documents again one evening more out of habit than necessity. Ownership confirmed, authority intact, no exposure on my side. The outcome was locked. Only the reveal remained, and that was a matter of timing, not doubt. For the first time since the party, I felt something close to calm. Not relief, resolution. There were moments when I wondered if I should step in sooner, spare them the anxiety of not knowing. Then I remembered how easily they'd lived with my anxiety for years, how naturally they'd let me sit with uncertainty as long as it kept the system running. This wasn't cruelty. It was symmetry. As the deadline passed, the tension sharpened. Calls were made, meetings scheduled, advisors consulted. The language shifted from confident to cautious, from dismissal to damage control. My father's certainty grew louder, his reassurances more frequent, as if repetition alone could restore stability. It didn't. Behind the scenes, the mechanisms continued to turn. Notices prepared, processes queued. Everything moved at a pace that felt glacial to those waiting for answers and perfectly measured to those holding them. I remained invisible. That invisibility changed how I felt about the past. Distance stripped it of emotion and left only facts. I could see the family dynamic for what it had been, a system built on assumptions that no longer applied. The moment I stopped participating, it lost coherence. They were still playing a game I'd already exited. The first hint of panic reached me indirectly. A mutual contact mentioned that my sister seemed distracted, that she was scrambling to secure assurances that didn't come. Another noted the strain on my parents, the way my father's voice wavered when he insisted everything was under control. I felt no satisfaction in it, only confirmation. This was always going to happen. The debt hadn't created the collapse. It had revealed it. One night, as I sat at my desk reviewing unrelated work, I received a notification that the meeting request had been sent. Formal. Non-negotiable. The language was careful, authoritative, stripped of emotion. A final opportunity to discuss default. I didn't smile. I didn't react at all. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, not because it would hurt them, but because it would end the guessing. The confrontation would be contained, precise, undeniable. No room for reinterpretation or rewriting history. I chose the setting deliberately. Neutral. Corporate. A space that belonged to process, not memory. Power lives in rooms like that, where feelings don't echo and words are recorded. In the days leading up to it, my family prepared for a fight they thought they understood. Legal arguments, moral appeals. Familiar tactics sharpened for use against a faceless opponent. They didn't know the opponent had already been sitting with the outcome for weeks. I spent those days quietly, the way I always had. Work, exercise, sleep. The ordinariness of it all grounded me. This wasn't revenge. It was completion. On the morning of the meeting, I arrived early and took my seat without drawing attention. I didn't need to rehearse what I would say. The paper would speak first. It always did. As the clock ticked forward, I felt no rush of adrenaline, no fear, no anger, just patience. They were walking into a room believing they still had leverage, believing the problem was external, temporary, negotiable, believing silence meant weakness. In a few moments, that belief would dissolve. Not with noise or spectacle, but with the quiet precision of truth delivered at the right time. The calm before panic isn't empty. It's full of everything people refuse to see until it's too late. The room smelled like polished wood and old confidence. My father arrived first, shoulders squared, carrying himself like a man who believed the world still bent when he spoke firmly enough. He took the seat closest to the head of the table without asking, claiming it by instinct. My mother followed, smoothing the front of her coat, eyes already scanning the room for cues on how to behave. My sister came last, phone clenched in her hand, jaw-tight, confidence held together by effort rather than belief. They were ready to negotiate with a stranger. They weren't ready to see me. I waited until everyone had settled, until the small talk ran dry, and the silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. Then I stepped forward and took my seat across from them. The moment landed without sound, but the impact was immediate. My father's face drained of color. My sister froze mid-breath. My mother's hand tightened around her purse as if she'd suddenly realized she was standing on unfamiliar ground. For a second, no one spoke. The room seemed to tilt, reality recalibrating itself around a new center of gravity. "What are you doing here?" my father asked finally, his voice sharp, defensive. "I'm here for the meeting," I said calmly. "Just like you." My sister laughed, a brittle sound that cracked before it finished forming. "This isn't funny," she said. "This is serious." "It is," I replied. "That's why I'm here." The legal representative entered then, professional and neutral, carrying a folder thick enough to end fantasies. He took his seat without acknowledging the tension, as if tension were just another line item on an agenda. He placed the folder on the table, centered, deliberate. "Shall we begin?" he asked. My father nodded, regaining some of his composure. "Yes. We're here to resolve a misunderstanding." The representative opened the folder and slid a document across the table, not toward my father but toward me. "As the current holder of the debt," he said, "she will lead." The words landed like a verdict. My sister stood abruptly, chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is insane," she said, looking between us. "You don't own anything." I met her eyes. "I do." My father shook his head slowly. "You're confused," he said. "You don't understand how this works." "I understand exactly how it works," I said, keeping my voice level. "That's why I bought it." Silence rushed back in, heavier than before. My mother spoke next, her tone pleading, already trying to rewrite the moment. "If this is about money, we can talk," she said. "There's no need for hostility." "This isn't about hostility," I said. "It's about ownership." The representative slid another page forward, this time toward my father. "The debt has been legally transferred," he said. "Effective 3 weeks ago." My father stared at the paper, eyes scanning lines that refused to rearrange themselves into something familiar. "This can't be right," he muttered. "It is," the representative replied. "And it's enforceable." My sister's voice rose. "She wouldn't do this," she said almost to herself. "You wouldn't." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The room filled with reactions instead. Anger first, loud and desperate. Accusations followed, aimed everywhere except where they belonged. My father tried authority, then logic, then indignation. My mother tried tears. My sister tried rage. None of it moved the documents. When the representative outlined the terms, the language was clinical, stripped of emotion. Defaults, timelines, enforcement, eviction. Each word landed with precision, building a structure that left no room for reinterpretation. "This is revenge," my sister said, finally pointing at me. "You're doing this because of what Dad said." I looked at her, then really looked. "No," I said. "I'm doing this because of what you did." The forged signature was placed on the table. The air changed instantly. My father went still. My mother's breath caught. My sister's face collapsed into something raw and unguarded. The lie they'd carried for so long had finally been pulled into the light, and it did not soften under scrutiny. "This isn't possible," my father whispered. "It is," I said. "And it's documented." My mother reached for the paper as if she could fold it away, hide it back into the past. "We meant to fix it," she said. We were going to tell you, when I asked. After it ruined me. My sister sank back into her chair, the fight draining out of her. You could have just helped, she said weakly. You had the money. I nodded once. I did, I said. And I chose not to. That was the moment everything shifted. Not because of the debt or the meeting or the documents, but because they finally understood what they had lost. Not money, not property, access. I wasn't negotiating anymore. I was concluding. The representative cleared his throat. The terms are straightforward, he said. Vacate the property within 72 hours. Failure to comply will result in formal enforcement. My father stood again, but this time there was no authority left in the movement. You can't do this, he said, voice breaking. We're your family. I met his gaze without flinching. You stopped being my family when you decided my name was yours to use. No one spoke after that. The meeting ended the way all final things do quietly. Papers gathered, chairs pushed back, eyes averted. I stood last unhurried, watching them process a future that no longer included my protection. As I walked out, I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. The building doors closed behind me with a soft, decisive sound. The city moved on, indifferent and steady. I breathed in the cold air and let it settle. 3 weeks after being told to live on the streets, I had evicted my own family. Not out of anger, out of clarity. The first thing that arrived was silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the brittle, suspended quiet that follows a structural collapse. No calls from my parents, no messages from my sister, no indirect outreach through relatives or family friends. The group chat went dormant, its last message hanging there like a relic from a life that had already expired. I knew better than to mistake that silence for acceptance. Families like mine didn't retreat. They regrouped. On the 4th day after the meeting, the emails started. They didn't come to me directly. They came to my attorney phrased in the language of concern and confusion. Requests for extensions. Claims of miscommunication. Vague references to verbal understandings and family context. Each message carried the same subtext. Surely this could be softened if I would just come back into my role. I didn't respond. The second wave was less polite. My father sent a formal letter alleging bad faith acquisition, accusing an unnamed party of exploiting inside information to destabilize a family business. It was written in his old voice, the one that assumed confidence alone could bend outcomes. He CC'd people who no longer mattered and threatened actions he no longer controlled. My attorney handled it with one sentence. All communication must go through counsel. Any further contact will be considered harassment. That closed one door. Another opened the next morning. My sister showed up at my building. She didn't text ahead, didn't call the concierge. She stood in the lobby like a misplaced exhibit pacing in front of the security desk. Face bare of makeup coat pulled tight as if she could hold herself together by force. When the concierge called up to ask if I wanted to see her, I waited a full minute before answering. Send her up, I said. She entered my apartment like someone stepping onto a fault line, eyes flicking over the space despite herself. The clean lines, the quiet, the absence of anything borrowed. Her gaze lingered too long on details she couldn't afford to acknowledge. She didn't sit. I just want to talk, she said. You're talking, I replied. Her composure cracked almost immediately. You humiliated us, she said. You didn't have to do it that way. I did, I said. Because that's how it was done to me. She scoffed. You always make everything personal. I tilted my head. You forged my name. Her jaw tightened. We were desperate. You were entitled, I corrected. She paced once, then stopped. Do you know what happens now? She asked. People are talking. Dad's reputation is not my responsibility, I said. She stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. You really don't care anymore. I care, I said. Just not about the things you want me to. That was the moment she shifted tactics. She sat down slowly, elbows on her knees, voice lowering. "If you go through with this," she said, "you'll be the one everyone blames. You'll be the villain, the daughter who destroyed her own family." I met her eyes. I didn't destroy anything I said. I stopped absorbing the damage. She left 10 minutes later without another word. The next attempt came from my mother. She didn't confront me. She performed. She called extended family, old friends, church acquaintances. She cried softly, publicly about heartbreak and misunderstanding, about how money had changed me, about how she didn't recognize her own child anymore. I watched the ripple effect from a distance. Messages arrived from people who hadn't spoken to me in years, framed as concern but dripping with judgment. I didn't defend myself. I didn't correct the story. I didn't explain. Let them believe whatever made sense to them. I was done auditioning for sympathy. By the end of the week, the practical consequences began to land. The locks on my sister's office were changed. Notices were posted. Staff were dismissed with severance handled cleanly and legally. Vendors called to renegotiate contracts that no longer existed. The business she'd built on borrowed credibility collapsed with alarming speed once the scaffolding was removed. My father tried once more. This time he called me directly. I answered. "You've made your point," he said without greeting. "Now end it." "No," I replied. "You're punishing everyone," he snapped. "Over one mistake. One crime," I said. Repeated. Silence crackled on the line. Then his voice lowered. "You think you're stronger now I am," I said. "You think money makes you untouchable." "No," I said. "Clarity does." He hung up. That night, I stood by my window and watched the city move, lights blinking in patterns too complex to control. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. For the first time in my life, my actions matched my reality. The next morning, the final document was executed. The eviction clock began its last countdown. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. My presence had already done its work. 3 weeks after being told to live on the streets, my family stood on the other side of a locked door, forced to reckon with the truth they'd tried to bury under my name. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down at my desk, opening my laptop, not to watch the fallout, but to continue my work. The past was finished. What came next was mine. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments like debris washing ashore after a storm everyone pretended had passed. The first sign was the house. My parents' house went up for sale quietly without the usual announcements or photos meant to impress. No open house, no social media posts. Just a listing that appeared and disappeared within a week, snapped up by an investor who didn't ask questions. The neighborhood noticed anyway. They always did. In places like that, silence was louder than scandal. I heard about it from someone else. Not my parents. Not my sister. Someone who thought I should know. I closed the message without replying. Then there was the church. My mother stopped attending after the first Sunday when people avoided her eyes. After the second, when someone asked too gently how she was holding up. After the third, when the pastor suggested prayer for humility and accountability during announcements. She never went back. That part reached me through a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years who framed it as concern, but couldn't hide the curiosity. I gave her nothing. I wasn't interested in narrating their downfall for an audience that had been comfortable believing lies about me for years. My sister disappeared for a while. No online presence, no sightings, no updates. I assumed she was staying with friends until the invitations stopped coming, until the reality of being inconvenient settled in. People love ambition until it becomes contagious with failure. My father lasted longer. Pride can keep a man upright even when everything else collapses. He tried consulting, tried positioning himself as a victim of aggressive investors and a disloyal daughter. The story didn't stick. Too many details didn't line up. Too many bridges had already burned. People listened politely and then declined to get involved. The world moved on. I didn't celebrate any of it. I didn't need to. What surprised me was how little I missed them. I'd expected grief, or guilt, or at least the echo of old reflexes pulling me back toward reconciliation. Instead, there was space. Clean, uninterrupted space where my thoughts no longer bent themselves around anticipation or defense. I slept better. I worked better. I breathed differently. One evening, weeks later, I found an envelope slipped under my door. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was my mother's handwriting. Not an apology, not really. She wrote about motherhood, about fear, about how she'd done what she thought was necessary to protect the family. She didn't use the words crime or forgery or betrayal. She used words like pressure and panic and misunderstanding. At the bottom she wrote, "I hope one day you'll remember that I loved you in the only way I knew how." I read it once. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer I rarely opened. Some things didn't need answers. The final interaction came unexpectedly. It was a voicemail from my sister. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Not weak, just stripped of performance. I don't expect anything she said. "I just wanted you to know. I get it now. I don't agree with how you did it, but I get why." She paused. "I'm sorry I let them use you." That was all. I didn't call her back, but I didn't delete the message either. Forgiveness wasn't a switch. It was a distance, and I wasn't done measuring it yet. On the 3-month mark from the New Year's party, I stood in front of my mirror adjusting my coat before heading out to a meeting. I caught my own reflection and realized something had shifted in the way I held myself. I looked unburdened, not triumphant, not hardened, just unburdened. The version of me who would have tried to fix everything, who would have negotiated, who would have absorbed the consequences to keep the peace felt like a different person now. Not dead, just retired. I had stopped being available as collateral. Later that night, as I walked back into my apartment, I paused by the window overlooking the city. Somewhere out there, people were still telling versions of the story. Some cast me as cold, some as cruel, some as a cautionary tale. I let them. The truth didn't need consensus. It needed boundaries. I picked up my phone and scrolled past old contacts, old threads, old obligations that no longer had a claim on my time. The silence that followed wasn't brittle anymore. It was stable, earned. The streets my father had threatened me with were full of people surviving realities far harsher than his imagination. I had never belonged to his fear of failure, and I had never been as close to losing everything as he wanted me to believe. The irony didn't make me smile, but it did make me steady, because I finally understood what power looked like when it wasn't borrowed, announced, or defended. It looked like walking away without asking to be followed, and knowing without doubt that nothing behind you was worth turning back for. The last thing I did was change my phone number. Not out of anger, not out of fear, out of completion. There are moments in life when you don't slam a door, you simply stop holding it open. That morning, as sunlight stretched across the clean surfaces of my apartment, I realized I had reached one of those moments. Nothing was chasing me anymore. No loose ends, no unfinished arguments, no need to be understood. I made coffee and stood by the window watching the city wake up. Cars moved with purpose. People walked with places to be. The world hadn't paused for my family drama, and that was exactly the point. My life had always existed parallel to theirs, never truly intersecting, even when I tried to force it. What I felt wasn't victory. It was relief. Weeks had passed since the eviction, since the signatures, since the last confrontation, where everything finally crystallized into truth. My sister's company was gone. My parents' social standing had quietly eroded. Not with explosions or headlines, but with absence. Invitations that stopped arriving. Calls that went unanswered. Influence that evaporated when it could no longer be propped up by borrowed credibility. I hadn't orchestrated their downfall. I had simply stepped out of the way. People often confuse revenge with destruction. But what I learned is that the most devastating consequence is withdrawal. When you stop compensating, when you stop fixing, when you stop absorbing the cost of someone else's choices. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop not to check messages, not to monitor fallout, but to work. The same work I'd been doing long before anyone in my family noticed my absence. The kind that didn't need applause to be real. Halfway through the morning, I paused and let myself think back to that New Year's party. The music, the lights, my father's voice cutting clean through the room. If you fail, go live in the streets. At the time, it had sounded like a threat. Now it sounded like a projection. He had needed me to be afraid, needed me to believe I was one misstep away from disaster. Because if I wasn't, then his authority meant nothing. His version of success meant nothing. His control meant nothing. And control, I realized, had been the real inheritance in my family. Not love, not security. Control. I had declined it. That afternoon, I took a walk without my phone. Just me and the city moving at an unhurried pace. I passed people who would never know my story, never judge it, never twist it into something useful for themselves. There was comfort in that anonymity. For the first time, my silence felt like choice, not exile. When I returned home, I found myself smiling at something small and unexpected. A plant on my windowsill had grown a new leaf. It was subtle, easy to miss. But it was there. Growth doesn't announce itself. It just happens when the conditions are right. I didn't hear from my parents again. I heard once indirectly that my mother still told her version of the story to anyone who would listen. That she framed herself as misunderstood. That she said I'd changed. That money had made me cold. I let that be her ending. Mine didn't need narration. As the day faded into evening, I sat down and wrote one final email. Not to them, to myself. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't dramatic, it was practical. I wrote down what I would no longer tolerate, what I would no longer explain, what I would no longer sacrifice in the name of peace. I saved it, closed the laptop, and felt something settle into place. Peace doesn't come when other people apologize. It comes when you stop waiting for them to. If you're still here with me, still listening to this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been cast as the problem in a family that benefits from your silence? Have you ever been told you were failing only to realize later that you were simply refusing to play a role that was never yours? If this story stirred something in you, I'd love to hear it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from or what part of this journey felt familiar to you. You're not alone in these experiences, even when they make you feel isolated. And if you want to stay with this channel where stories aren't about loud revenge but quiet consequences, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this ahead, and sometimes hearing someone else put words to what you've lived can be its own kind of closure. Thank you for staying until the end, for listening, for reflecting. Some endings don't come with forgiveness or reconciliation. They come with freedom. And that finally is enough.